Hello, everyone. Just want to welcome you to our second to last lecture here on for California labor, it's union rights and reform. What I wanted to cover today were very specifically challenges facing unions, but namely, I want to focus on one specific policy, which is the right to work laws. Second, I want to focus on immigrant rights and workers' rights, where there's been progress in terms of organized labor and some of the existing challenges. And then finally, I want to cover why union matters for all workers. Now, in terms of thinking about legal challenges or law or policy based challenges for unions, I think it's important to note that there isn't just one single law that will effectively impact the relative success um, or failure of unions. But what we need to think about is that oftentimes it is a collection of different laws that can impact the effectiveness of union organizing in a particular place, locale, state, or at the national level. So what we do know is that, for example, the National Labor Relations Board, which has numerous sort of local entities but governs collective organizing and establishment of unions, whoever controls the NLRB has a very significant influence on the relative strength of unionism in the United States. So, particularly, for example, under the Ronald Reagan administration, he tended to flout unions altogether. Um, Firing, for example, under Reagan, he fired all of the air traffic controllers when they threatened to strike, basically ignoring sort of union laws there. Um, we've seen, particularly under democratic presidencies, that there tends to be a much stronger relationship with unions. Looking at the Clinton administration as well as even the Obama administration, they tend to be much stronger in terms of their relationships with labor. Now, that said, I think it's also important to look at policies that are being implemented or passed in different countries that effectively impact workers. And one of the more significant laws is right to work. Now, I could talk about a lot of different policies like living wage and those kind of things, but I felt like those might be policies that you've heard about in other classes. And so I wanted to stick strictly to something that directly relates to organized labor and unions. Now, right to work laws, what a right to work law is a statute in the United States that prohibits union security agreements or agreements between labor unions and employers that govern the extent to which an established union can require employees' membership, payment of union dues, or fees as a condition of employment, either before or after hiring. Essentially, what right to work laws do is that they say that workers, even if they benefit from collective bargaining agreements, don't have to pay union dues. Um, that particularly union dues to unions that are already established at a site. So, for example, if you think about janitorial workers in a lot of our major buildings here in Los Angeles, they're largely organized by Service Employees International Union. And so, as a pre-existing union, new employees would pay union dues to SEIU. Now, I think one of the important things to think about is that these right to work laws are really designed to defund unions as a way in which to take away the financial base of unions. And there are many ways in which unions have worked with these laws. For example, with part-time employees, refunding particular portions of their fees, etc. But in right-to-work states, essentially, it creates a clause for employees that they can opt out of union dues, while at the same time earning the same amount of money as those who are unionized. What this effectively does is disempowers the unions. Right to work laws exist in 22 different states in the United States, and they've been around for almost 25 years. The earliest right to work laws were passed in Alabama almost 22 years ago, and one of the most recent right to work laws was passed at the very beginning of 2013 with Michigan. So what we begin to see here, and the reason I show you this map, is that we also know that right to work, although California is not a right to work state, um, that we do see right to work is very focused on the Deep South. Now, there have been different moments where, under different governors, they have tried to pass right to work laws, but unions in California tend to be very, very strong. And so one of the things I want to point out here is this is where what we begin to see is variability based on state. That unions don't have sort of uniform influence across the country, and we also know that laws are implemented differently across the country. So arguments against right to work. Labor unions are generally universal in their opposition to right to work laws. They argue that each person that benefits directly from union representation should pay their fair share of the cost of that representation. They also believe that in the very least, represented persons should pay a dues amount to cover the expense of negotiating and administering the labor agreement. So here I want to pause and remind you that we also know from the readings in this class that unions do not solely focus on on negotiating contracts for their workers. That is one of many facets of unionization. Unions are also often those who take care of occupational safety issues. They do professional development for their workers. They also do political lobbying. They do a number of different activities that are outside the scope of just negotiating a contract. And so the argument for unions here is that they believe that at the very least, an individual who's going to benefit from those negotiations should help offset those costs. Unions also argue that the term right to work is very deceiving. And that basically what it says, you have a right, that it basically takes away the right to work in a unionized settings, and that what they want to do is sort of give people the benefits of collective representation without having to pay for it. Now, moving forward, the arguments for right to work. Right to work makes a more attractive investment to states, right? This is one of the sort of economic arguments, that right to work it creates a much more attractive investment for corporations. Passage of right to work laws will lead to job growth, and that finally, in a more libertarian argument, individuals should not be required to financially support a collective. So these are sort of the three main reasons that are touted or discussed in right to work debates. So I think it's important to also look at what are the facts, though, and this is one of the things I think I press in this class a lot is here's perception, here are the arguments, but what are the empirical truths? What are the actual facts about states with and without right to work statutes? So the Economic Policy Institute, which does a lot of different types of research on work and labor across the United States using different types of data, is widely regarded as one of the great think tanks, did a study of right to work. And what they noted is right to work laws have not universally succeeded in boosting employment growth in the states that have adopted them. The economic success of right to work laws varies dramatically from state to state. Now, the reason why disaggregating state to state is important is that if you look up all of these sort of different campaigns on right to work, they largely focus on the success of right to work on a national level. But essentially what that research does is skews the huge differences of what's happening on a state-by-state basis and averages things out so it seems uniformly positive. And so what the Economic Policy Institute points out is that in Right to Work Arizona, they did see employment grow by almost 19% between 2000 and 2009. Whereas Right to Work Alabama saw its employment shrink by more than 5%. Also, within that same decade, economic growth was 8.2% in non-right to work New Mexico, which is more than triple the rate of their right to work neighbor, Oklahoma. So part of what they're pointing to here is, number one, this may not be about right to work laws, that we are beginning to see job growth or economic success. Secondly, we see huge differentials based on state, right? That these can also be tied to different tax incentives that are built into the laws in different states as well. So here I want to point out is that while campaigns make these grandiose claims about one particular law, we need to look at a larger structure that discusses what's happening. Another thing to think about, and the report goes on to say, is non-right-to-work states of Washington, Alaska, and New Mexico each saw jobs grow faster than 15 of the 22 right-to-work states. So again, right to work does not necessarily equal faster job growth across the board. By the end of 2010, both the highest and lowest stated unemployment rates were found in right-to-work jurisdictions. Again, we go back to by disaggregating the data, we begin to see the sort of unequal development of employment, right? And certainly it undermines the claim of greater job security. There's no way to empirically analyze if one policy, like right to work, can impact job creation. In fact, when we talk about job creation, studies focus almost solely on service sector and manufacturing, but ignore tech industries and other knowledge labor. So again, this is so what we may be seeing is a dynamic of what is happening in the manufacturing industries or the service industries, not necessarily about the impact of a policy. Studies also show that it is the relative strength of the education system in a state and the education of the state's population that has a strong correlation with improving the economy of that state. Here, I also want to point out, like when we look at this third and fourth bullet on this slide, the difference between causality and correlation. Causality means that A causes B. That, for example, if you were to punch a brick wall, the cause the effect may be that you get hurt, right? Sorry, that may not be the best example, but it's all I have right now. Correlation is more about a relationship, and that relationship can be either positive or negative. And so here, what it says is that education has a positive. What we do know is that education has a positive relationship with job that we know that education has a positive relationship with job creation in a state. Basically mean the more educated your population, the better able they are to be innovative. We also know that unions have a significant and positive effect on the wages and benefits of union and non-union workers alike. The effect on the average worker, unionized or not, of working in a right-to-work state is to earn approximately $1,500 less per year than a similar worker in a state without such a law. In other words, those who work in right-to-work states tend to earn about $1,500 more a year. Workers in right-to-work states are significantly less likely to receive employer-provided health insurance or pensions. If benefits coverage in non-right-to-work states were lowered to the levels of states with these laws, 2 million fewer workers would receive health insurance, and 3.8 million fewer workers would receive pensions nationwide. So again, what you would look at here is that you would basically be looking at the ways in which we see inequalities in health, and how old people have to be, and how long people have to work before they're allowed to retire. Union density also has a positive effect on workplace safety in states with no right-to-work laws. So for every 1% increase in unionization rates, there's a 0.35% decline in construction fatality rates. And so that looked specifically at construction fatality rates. What these different studies have shown is that unions tend to be much better about oversight around worker safety issues. So what I want you to take away from this right-to-work discussion is to really think about what laws impact the ability of a union to do its job. I think it's also important to think about the underlying issues, which should make us think about the way in which power is structured in the United States. Why would corporations feel that they want to lobby for this type of legislation? Cost savings? Is it really about job creation? What are the net benefits? So I think part of what we want to think about here, and I want you to think of right-to-work as a case study within it, we want to look at the ways in which laws can impact the quality of life for workers. Now, on that note, in terms of quality of life and how we want to think about workers' rights, right to work is one of many policies. On a much more grandiose level, I think I want us to step away from a very specific type of law and right to work and look at immigrant rights, and specifically immigrant rights as worker rights. Now, immigration law is much more nuanced than a right to work law. This involves, foreign policy. involves economic policy. It also, at an international level, is part of human rights issues. So in that way, it's a little bit more complicated, and it moves us into a realm of different types of organizing. What we do know is that the types of laws in place at local, state, and national levels impact workers' wages, benefits, and safeties. And this is all workers, regardless of their documentation status. Studies show that the presence of unions provide greater worker protection for workers without regard to citizenship. In other words, what we begin to see via these studies is that even for those without documents or for immigrants who may be here on work visas, which are temporary, right? That you're temporarily allowed to be here. Usually, those are the most vulnerable individuals and most likely to be forced into compliance, despite the fact that there may be safety violations, exploitation, violations of labor law. What studies have shown is that unions work as an intermediary, as a organization that can intercede on their behalf and provide them with protections to be able to assert for their workers' rights. Over the past 15 years, organized labor has tried to reform its xenophobic and racist past. As we've already talked about earlier in this class, we do know organized labor was first developed as a way in which to consolidate white male power and citizenship in the United States, excluding numerous immigrant groups, including early white European groups that were not deemed white at the time. So, for example, Italians and the Irish. And so part of what organized labor has tried to do is to really rethink who's working in the United States. Who do they need to organize? And how do we move beyond just contract unionism? So what they've had to do over the last 15 years is to look at changing their strategies. They needed to move away from site-based negotiations and a focus on contract unionism, where it's just about how do I organize my site without regard to what's going on in workers' lives. Instead, they want to focus on what we call social movement unionism, that connects the plight of workers to broader social issues. So broader social issues meaning immigration laws, education, safety, environmentalism. So many of the different issues that are talked about in Brodkin's work on Making Democracy Matter. By focusing on these larger issues, they believe that they can help improve the overall lives of the workers in jobs. But in order to do this, they also needed to be cognizant of the space in which they were working. They needed to address changes in political economy. What they had to acknowledge is that in the United States, the economy was no longer a manufacturing environment. And while unions in the United States were at their strength at the time in which manufacturing was strong, the reality is manufacturing was outsourced to other countries. But simultaneously, you saw the growth of the service and government sectors in the United States. And the unions and organized labor nationally had to re-examine who workers were in industries and focus on areas of potential growth. And I think this happened in numerous ways. I'm going to give you two examples. One, here in Los Angeles, this was one of their very first geographic locations in which the Los Angeles County Federation of Labor, initially under the guidance of the late Miguel Contreras, reconfigured how it worked. They took despite the fact that it put them at odds with the national organized labor communities, they started organizing immigrants and immigrant workers. They started changing their tactics. Where, for example, for those of you guys, when I had you watch Bread and Roses earlier in the semester, the tactics were no longer just about holding a picket sign outside your place of work, but also thinking creatively about the economy, about who's impacted. So they would do strikes that impacted consumers. They would also look at people. So in the Justice for Janitors movie, they also showed that that you can also picket the people who rent in the buildings that you clean, right? But you may not be contracted by. These were differential strategies designed for the new economy. Second, what they also had to do was Another example, was the Communication Workers of America, as well as SAG and AFTRA. SAG and AFTRA being the unions that control actors, radio, etc. And if you look at all of the industry reports, what you begin to see is that profits had essentially plateaued in the English-speaking market. They weren't necessarily losing money, but they weren't necessarily making money. And in one of the very first big campaigns for SAG-AFTRA and Communication Workers of America, what you began to see is the need to organize Spanish language television. Now, when you look at the financial reports of a group like NBC Universal, what you found was that NBC Universal's English side was, like I said, plateaued. But where they saw exponential financial growth for almost a decade was in the Spanish language market, and how they were able to gain money was by using the same facilities as the English speaking counterparts. So, for example, you would have broadcasts of Telemundo and their news in the same house as where NBC News Los Angeles is filmed. And so what they began to do was to start organizing Spanish language workers to improve wages, because what they found is that despite the fact that they were servicing similar numbers of people, albeit that none of them were not necessarily in the Spanish language market. It wasn't just in LA, they were also broadcasting to other parts of the country. Despite the fact they were reaching the same number of people and earning more profit, the workers were making less than half of their English counterparts. And so what they began to do is what they call a wall-to-wall campaign. Well, they organized all classification of workers who worked at that site and also tapped into larger issues of workplace rights, of racism and discrimination to organize against places like NBC Universal. This is still an ongoing battle that's been going on for quite a while. But part of the success story here is that they had to rethink who they were organizing and why they had to organize these groups. I think the other piece to think about in terms of why immigrant rights are workers' rights are the sort of core central arguments for immigration reform that have been in place for over 15 years. There have been sort of four basic demands that have been promoted over the last 10 to 15 years. One is legalization of immigrants living and working in the United States. What they want to acknowledge is that those without documents are here without documents for multiple reasons. Some of them are about the U.S.'s inability to process visas in a timely manner. Part of it is also about the political structures of their home country. But the reality is, you have people who have been crossing borders and living and working in the United States. But also, let me take a step back. Is that a lot of undocumented immigrants. Undocumented immigrants are not just those people who cross borders. Another significant population is attached to college-age individuals like yourself, whereas immigrants, they get out of status, is what we call it, when, as they graduate college, they don't change their visa type or are unable to renew visas because they're no longer students. They can't switch it over to a work visa. And so here you have a number of people who pay taxes, pay into Social Security systems, but are unable to gain benefits. So one of the main platforms for immigrant rights and immigrant reform communities has been legalization of immigrants. How this, and as we know, is that these immigrants aren't just freeloading here, but in fact are very essential to the sort of economic well-being. So this legalization issue is very important to workers. A road to citizenship for all immigrants. So here, this is sort of while this could affect undocumented, what this particular claim is about is for those who have been legal permanent residents of the United States, those with green cards. And one particular issue that I want you to think about, or one particular case I want you to think about is that for many, the ability to become a naturalized U.S. citizen can take somewhere between 5 and 10 years, depending on ethnicity, race, and the ability to process paperwork. Particularly in the case of Filipinos, which is one specific group, we know that time to citizenship can be upwards of 10 to 15 years. Now, I want us to rewind back to 9/11, September 11th, 2001. Right after 9/11, President Bush passed a law that's basically said that the transportation and safety, the TSA agents that you see at airports must be U.S. citizens. Now, what's interesting in this is that many of the airport security across the country, but in particular San Francisco, Los Angeles, Boston, and New York, were in fact immigrants with legal permanent residence, many of whom were in the process of getting their citizenship. These individuals lost their jobs outright because of the new rules of TSA. Now, part of what worker advocates at the time called for was the fact that if, in fact, we had a system that allowed them to process their citizenship papers in a timely manner, many of these individuals would still have a job, and yet they were being penalized for something that was essentially out of their control. So, road to citizenship, particularly for those who choose to be naturalized, is also an important part of being able to enforce labor rights, to be able to hold jobs in some cases, particularly as it relates to the government sector. Speedy and humane reunification of families. I don't know that we need to cover this very much. We've talked about it earlier on in class with transnational motherhood and the number of families that are disconnected. And as I've noted earlier, when we build border walls, not only do we keep people out, but we also keep people in, and that's been very significant in terms of keeping families separated. And then finally, guarantees of workplace rights, including the right to organize a union for all workers regardless of their immigration status. Workplace rights are everything from collective bargaining, the ability to file grievances, the ability to talk about occupational safety, and to address these issues. This has really been at the core of what people have called the New Voice campaign for the AFL-CIO, and in some cases have been very successful, in others not so much. But I think what I really want to point out here is that on the one hand, you have this immigration reform agenda, right? And oftentimes we talk about immigration reform separate from workers. But really, what's been pushing immigration reform for almost over a decade has been the labor movement. And in particular, it's very connected to who they're organizing, what they're doing, and why. And I think when we talk about why unions are important for all workers, regardless of immigration status, regardless of class status, is that essentially what we begin to see, and the story and narrative you should be getting from this lecture, is that it helps equalize the playing field, it helps promote better wages, it helps improve occupational safety, that it also provides a semblance of protection for workers from retaliation, and that despite claims to the contrary, what we do see is that even in non-right to work states, what you begin to see is that wages are generally higher for all those populations, regardless of whether they're in unions or not. So think about these things as you're moving forward, because what we should be able to do is start linking together these different social issues, because they really are at the core of workers' rights.